Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Richard Brown.
Good morning, folks. American Express is a proud sponsor of the annual MASS Summit, and we have a long history of supporting and preserving landmarks. In fact, the company and its employees provided funding for the construction of the Statue of Liberty's stone pedestal. Through our long-standing partnership with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the World Monuments Fund, we've supported numerous historic landmarks locally, nationally, and internationally. And like many of you, we are poised to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the 1965 Landmarks Law that MASS fought so hard to pass. Today, there are more than 31,000 landmark properties in New York City, 111 historic districts, and 20 historic district extensions in all 5 boroughs. The achievements of the Landmarks Preservation Commission are undisputable. But with this milestone approaching, the city will have to grapple with how historic preservation will evolve to meet the needs of the 21st century New York. 50 years ago, an aging warehouse was an obstacle to a new office tower. But today, it's precisely what tech companies are looking for. Are we at the point where preservation isn't just about keeping our historical sites assets preserved in amber, but embracing opportunities for us to leverage them for competitive advantage? Please welcome our moderator, Manuela Hoelterhoff, Mass Director and Chief Cultural Critic at Bloomberg, and her distinguished panel to more deeply delve into this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to start with a few facts. There are 31,000 landmark properties in New York City, 111 historic districts, 1,338 individual landmarks, and then 10 scenic landmarks. And as we sit here, all of us are getting a little older, and so are the buildings around us. So what are we going to do? I mean, we have this slogan, new ideas need old buildings, but old buildings need new ideas too, I think. So I thought I would start with you, Jorge, and tell us what you can do to bring those two ideas together, new and old.
Well, I mean, I think one place we could start to think about is the fact that we've been talking a lot about residents. We haven't talked a lot today about visitors to the city. But monuments and historic buildings organize our attention in the city. They help us to map out the city. And many of them attract more eyeballs than television shows. So they are, in a way, a form of media. So how can we think about our interventions in monuments in a way that begins to reorganize our attention to the city, begins for us to draw attention to other parts of the city that are not just Midtown, that are not just, Manhattan. So there's ways in which preservationists can work to think through a new image of the city. And as the city is evolving and joining other global capitals, we're seeing more and more of that.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us, Richard, what is a building that you have recently worked on, a landmark building or a senior building that required new ideas, new technologies?
Let's see, most recently, probably we completed a complete renovation of the Yale Art Gallery at Yale University, which is comprised of 3 beautiful landmark buildings, one an 1863 Victorian Gothic, one kind of Romanesque building, and then the famous Louis Kahn 1953 Art Gallery, inside of which was just a complete mess, really, and a museum that had no functioning system. So I think the challenge there for us is to make a 21st century museum environment. It's literally like a submarine built inside of an old
What did
building.
Louis Kahn forget to do?
He forgot he had yet to learn about waterproofing and thermal breaks and all the kind of stuff that people don't think about, but at the same time, it is a canonical building. And we were charged with not making the sight lines any fatter than they are. It has to look exactly the way it does. But I've been in there before on a January day, and you could put your hand on the curtain wall and see the puddle of water on the floor. So those are challenges that actually modern buildings, older buildings are probably, usually much better off. They have thicker walls, less glass.
I was going to ask you, the older building of this complex, where there are three together, was the older building waterproof?
It was waterproof, but it still had single glazed windows. It still had, lots of those kinds of issues that 21st century museum environments, simply do not allow. So.
David, you've been involved also in rehabilitating iconic structures. Can you give us your example from?
Sure. The interesting, also a 20th century building, and actually I could cite another Louis Kahn building. We're working on Louis Kahn's Richards Labs at the University of Pennsylvania. But the issue there, I think what I'd like to do is sort of segue that into a larger issue, because many of these buildings are unloved, even the iconic ones. And I think that, so for some of the icons and for many of the tier 2 structures, there's an issue of getting people to love them again, getting people to understand, and using the intervention as a device, as a creative device, to sort of bring that back without losing the essence of the building. So it's a very creative, very design-focused discipline. It isn't simply about preserving the building. It's about making them high performance, to sort of make them much more robust from an energy use standpoint, but also to enable them to be loved. And I think that this is a problem that, considering that more buildings were built between 1945 and 1980 than in the whole history of mankind before that, is a big issue that we're facing as these buildings age.
As you build throughout America, throughout the states, are there lessons in preservations, observations that you could bring back to us?
I think the lesson is that people need to take a fairly enlightened view, and you need to focus on the big picture. You need to really start at 30,000 feet and not look particularly that this piece needs to preserve and that piece needs to be preserved, but to think about what's the essence of what needs to be preserved here. And I think that more and more the regulatory apparatus is coming around to this, but it's not the way in many cases that people are initially trained. So I think that there's kind of a sea change in terms of that sort of understanding of what needs to be done, particularly with modern buildings, that is a good lesson.
Bryan, you're next. Tell us about the pencil factory and how that turned into Makeshift.
Actually, when we rented the space that Makeshift Society exists in, we didn't know it was a pencil factory. We were looking for the important metric of ground flooriness. And it was one of the few spaces we found on the ground floor that we could afford in Williamsburg that was also large enough. And one of the things in that neighborhood is that the older buildings just are larger. And so it was something that suited our business there. Later, we found out that it was a pencil factory, and going to your point about allowing buildings to be loved, once we knew the history of the building, it was a much easier and much better story to tell. But we had to work like heck to find that story. And so one of our challenges was just like the ease of knowing about the city. Sure, the icons are the things that attract people from faraway places you can learn about, but the rest of the texture of the city is still quite hard to learn about, actually.
How did you find out about the pencils? Did you find a few, or
many sleepless nights on Google?
Yeah. So, and what happened to the poor pencil people?
They were replaced by a fur coat factory at some point.
Oh no!
Yeah, and then a kind of squat, and then eventually it was redeveloped by a developer.
Just before we came on, you told me about an interesting visitor. Now, you have to understand the pencil factory, the Makeshift Society, if you haven't been there, is fairly open to the street. And at one point, someone came in,
yeah,
not on foot, so to speak.
As I was saying, we looked for a space on the ground floor, and the reason we did that is because we want to have productive activity on ground level. New York is filled more and more every day with consumptive activity on the ground level. Being open to the street has been a great experience for us because literally strangers walk in all day, every day, including sometimes on rollerblades, as one person who kind of spun into the space and announced themselves.
Did he stay?
For a few minutes, yeah.
Tell us what goes on in there. What kind of thinking, what kind of creative processes?
It's a space for people working across the creative sector. So we have architects, graphic designers, illustrators, jewelry designers, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. And do they have, and they work in an open floor plan and they talk to each other, or what's the atmosphere like?
Yeah, it's very open. One of the things that we wanted to do was respect the original shell of the building. So our intervention architecturally sits kind of in the middle, almost as a submarine within, this shell.
Mm-hmm. And the area, have you seen it now change because of your footprint there, or what's going on in that place?
It's new. It's a bit premature maybe for a substantial change, but we've been
or to
there.
be chased out.
We've been there 6 months, and what we're seeing more and more is that people say, oh yeah, there's that thing here on the street that I didn't know about, and they kind of grow accustomed to it over time. So again, bringing productive activity to the neighborhood again is something that we see people recognize kind of little by little over time.
Richard, tell us about some upcoming projects that involve a landscape or a cityscape that is historic.
In New York, you mean?
Or that can be applied, the lessons of which could be applied.
Well, I actually been working a lot at Stanford University, which is experienced its own little building boom, but it has an unbelievably historic landscape that they treasure. I think it's probably that in the University of Virginia, I would say, are the most iconic university landscapes in America. So there, the challenge has been for us to, not only to fit in, but to, in the center of such creative thinking and innovation, to try and straddle that line and make something that feels new at the same time. So we're doing a new neuroscience, chemical biology building there. We've also completed, we just finished a small museum and a concert hall, and all of them are really trying to play with that vocabulary, 120 years of historic architecture at the same time being
David, you've also been working on an old science building.
Also at Stanford, right? Richard and I just sort of follow
Can't
each other.
get a variety here.
It's actually very close to his
Yeah.
project, but here it is actually, it's an extension to one of the historic buildings themselves. So it actually we're starting with, and there precisely it's the idea of taking what used to be just a chemistry building and to turning it into a center for innovation for undergraduates in the sciences. So so finding new ways to combine program and to sort of, again, make it attractive, make it a lovable building. And frankly, when you're also dealing with California seismic codes, it means you have to be very robust in terms of the amount of intervention. So what you need to do there actually is to create a kind of almost a score sheet of saying, this is what we have to preserve, understanding that much of what is left inside the building is going to have to go in the need of efficiency, economy, and public safety.
We were talking earlier, too, about how pollution, such an everyday fact of life, is affecting how architects think and design. Can you speak to that a bit, Jorge?
Well, in relation to preservation, sure. I mean, I think the thing to keep in mind is that, we're celebrating 50 years of the Landmarks Law and so on. I mean, preservation is, if it is anything, it's a radical idea. I mean, it's the idea that you can actually think beyond property, about the public good, and that there might be things that we treasure together. And so as the summit makes us think about equity, place, and opportunity, those are all issues that have to do with the public good. And our notions of the public good are changing. And they're changing also in relationship to questions of climate change and pollution. And so preservation needs to, in a way, begin to address pollution as something to be preserved, perhaps, because what we preserve is what we can regulate. So are there ways, for example, that we could, through our thinking about preservation, enter into a discussion about pollution? Now, preservation is about aesthetics. When we talk about pollution as if it was an abstraction, but it has real aesthetic impacts on the world around us. We try to act as if it doesn't, but the seas are full of plastic and our buildings are completely dirty. So how can we, from an aesthetic point of view, begin to enter into the conversation of the public good and into the conversation of pollution? Well, I think we have to stop acting as if it's not there and participating in the process of erasing it. We spend a lot of our time as preservationists cleaning buildings, making them look as if there is no pollution. So how can we begin to incorporate the negative into what we do as to bring attention to it? Because preservation is a way of organizing attention. We organize the attention of tourists around the city. So how can we do that? And that means we have to become more artistic, I think, as David was saying, more creative.
David?
I think that points out that a good friend and colleague of mine made a statement a few years ago, which has resonated with me, which is that sustainability has taken the moral high ground from preservation. And I think everything we do, and particularly with many of my charges, which are mid-century modern buildings, not always of the top quality, making them high-performance buildings and acknowledging that we cannot sacrifice the quality of the environment to preservation, and that there is this balance. It's not to say that you go away with it, but again, it's that you dive deeply, you do the kind of research, the kind of the upfront study of the building to really understand what's important, and then you sort of milk it and make it as sustainable and as good part of the neighbor in the good neighbor in the environment as it possibly can. I mean, we're not going to succeed without that kind of an ethos.
You've spoken about the unloved. We've all mentioned the unloved buildings, the Tier 2 and Tier 3 buildings. You even have a name for them: ordinary, everyday modernism, OEMs. What would you put into that some of the public housing, which is so extensive, especially in the city of New York, though away from the borough of Manhattan mostly?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly would put it in that category. And there's a very interesting study that's been done, if any of you are familiar with Toronto, by a fellow named Michael McClelland. And he's looked at, Toronto also has an enormous inventory of mid-century public housing and sort of moderate income housing. And they're actually developing community strategies for how to repurpose these buildings, for how to take them, make them more energy efficient, make them nicer, especially at the ground level. The GSA has this program called the First Impressions Program, which is designed to sort of make the interface with the landscape and the lobbies much more attractive, and to sort of be economical about where you have your big impact and just make the rest of it work. And I think I think those kinds of lessons are very applicable here in New York City with the stock of public housing you have.
When I was driving through Crown Heights and some of the areas there, and lots of public housing projects that have been built over the decades, they seem to get lower, which is a good thing, because parents can look and see where someone is, which you didn't have in the Pruitt-Igoe projects, which were blasted away, or a lot of the Corbusier buildings. But what was also very noticeable was the projects that were in much better shape had lots of greenery, had old trees, had some semblance of a landscape that embraced the buildings. Is that when you talk about sort of the first intervention, would that...
First impression. Oh, landscape is at least half of that. And I think you'll find it isn't just what you do with the building, it's what you do with the site, it's what you do with the approaches. It's making it so that you have a quality outdoor space as well as a quality indoor space.
Richard?
I was thinking that, I mean, one of the things that always amazed me about the preservation world is that it's so focused on architecture and not on urban design. And landmark districts, are full of buildings that don't necessarily, each one of them, add up to being an individual landmark, but it's the streetscape that makes it the historic district that's worth saving. Lou Kahn again said, the street is a room by agreement. So all of those spaces. It seems to me, people tend to look at the facades of buildings and they're standing in a street, and it's the streetscape that is really the space that's important. So you see landmark districts that have one side of the street is landmarked and the other side isn't.
If I may add to that, I mean, I think it's important, you know, when we were talking about this question of preservation being an idea, it's an idea about what is it to be preserved, so what is the object? And I think definitely we spend so much time thinking about the visuals that we often forget that we have bodies that move in space and that experience things. So one of the research that I do is on smell, for example. You know, I work a lot on the smell of monuments and recreate their historic smells. And, you know, as my daughter has entered...
Good smells or bad?
Well, that's the interesting thing. If you think, for example, of the smell of public housing, you know, what does it smell like? Or a public school. You know, my daughter just entered PS 87. And the smell of public schools in New York City is very different than the smell of private schools in New York City. Public schools have this, you know, distinct sort of cafeteria, reheated food smell, you know, the sort of unventilated, the windows don't work very well, sort of smells slightly dirty, you know, environment. So is there any way that we can preserve the smell and say, can we reintroduce the original smell of public schools, their fresh smell, the day when they were open to the public, and try to reintroduce that into the schools? Forget about the way they look. If they just begin to smell different, that means that we need to enter into partnerships with the perfume and fragrance industry, you know, because they are the ones that regulate that, and they're ones that produce that. And we don't need schools that smell like citrus, you know, all the time. You know, maybe there are ways in which we can begin to artistically engage into the reconstruction of the smells of the public realm. And I think that would completely change education in New York City, just change the way that public schools smell.
Or just using different cleaning materials, don't you think?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of deodorizing, you know, because a lot of these cleaning materials are about deodorizing, but it, you know, it has obviously impacts into ventilation and so on in the buildings, but we would have to think about how we rethink.
Well, I think this is something that that should be happening at Bryan's place. I think that I hope maybe you could encourage some thinking on making our environment smell better, look better, you know, serve us better.
Makeshift always smells wonderful. But what
Well, you've got open windows, probably.
What I was going to ask is, I mean, to what extent does operations play a role in preservation? Because, like, to your point about Pruitt-Igoe, I would argue that Pruitt-Igoe, yes, there might be architectural failures, but it's more an operational failure than anything else. And so, you know, when particularly you two gentlemen are working in these older buildings, you know, making a new curtain wall, for instance, will help make it easier to maintain. But to what extent do you go further and look at how that building lives as a system, not just ends on opening day?
I think that one of the things that we do on all our project is create guidelines, design and preservation guidelines. And we try to package the essence of that as a maintenance manual, so that we're saying, here's what's important about the building, here's how these things, so part of it is just the simple mechanics of how systems work and all that sort of thing, but it's also looking to just those issues to try to make it easy for the maintenance people to love the buildings as well as the other users.
For our last question and topic, which building today do you think might be a landmark 50 years from now?
You know,
Richard?
is this working?
Yes.
Okay. I was thinking the other day, and anybody's been up the West Side Highway recently, but the new Durst organization building that Big is doing, that Bjarke Ingels group, I think is an amazing, it's not finished yet, so, you know, the jury's still out. But I think it is really breaking the mold of so many of these towers that we see, cheap glass box towers that this town is plagued with. That is a whole nother animal up there. It's an amazing building.
Jorge?
I think we might have a discussion about the skyline of New York City as a landmark. That's
It's a little late, don't you?
a little late, but you know, I think what that would so when we think landmark, we think it's not going to move. But maybe if we start thinking about the skyline, we might revisit the idea of landmarking.
Lincoln Center, and I think because precisely because you've got this wonderful layer. I mean, you have this complex that cleared out a whole district of the city, built this cultural center to great controversy in many ways, was itself in many ways unloved. Now they've gone through and kind of reimagined it. And I think it'll be very interesting in 50 years to come back to it again and to say, okay, we have these very significant interventions that were done in the early 21st century. We have a significant complex from the 1950s and 60s. What's the next step? So I think that's going to be a very, how the significance of that is established and how a plan for moving forward for that is going to be really intriguing.
Brian?
I'm very curious to see with the storm protections along the coastline whether that becomes part of a preservation discussion. But in terms of buildings, I don't want to make any predictions.
For me, it's the Frank Gehry building on the West Side Highway for Diller. Whenever I drive by it, it just makes me happy. And I remember that story of while it was going up, there was construction around it. And apparently, the guys who were working on a subway, I think, were increasingly concerned that it wasn't straight. And then finally, someone went up to the top guy and said, "You know, that's not straight." And it had to be explained that this was, you know, Frank Gehry being Frank Gehry. Anyway, thank you very much. Our time is, well, we have 1 minute left.